Mine is probably quite full. And maybe your heart is aching a bit too. If you weren't able to attend, you missed a great party, an academic party, a chance to learn from the very best. We learned from David Gallo about the many wonders of the ocean, including black smokers, tube worm colonies, and two-faced squid, as well as undersea rivers and ponds. Dr. Maya Tolstoy taught us about the global ocean floor, including mid-ocean ridges, the relationship between earthquakes and undersea life along the ridges, earthquakes along subduction zones, and a potential tool for forecasting earthquakes. Dr. Barbara Block described the unique physiology of tuna, their migration patterns, and those of other large fish, mammals, and seabirds, how to tell if tuna are having sex, why it is important to learn more about them, and how we can help in that quest. And we learned from Dr. Bill Fitzgerald about mercury and methylmercury, under what conditions microbes can turn one into another, and why we should be concerned about it. We even heard about Alfred Nobel and the foundation from Executive Director Dr. Lawrence Heichenstein. And today, Dr. Chris Sabine enlightened us about the current state of CO2 in the atmosphere and ocean, told us how serious the problem is, and provided us with some hope and some solutions. Dr. Kathleen Dean Moore got us to think about how to love the ocean, indeed the earth, what it means to love the earth and why it is important. And I would be surprised if anyone in the audience wasn't touched by her talk. And Dr. Ove Hu Goldberg taught us about coral and their symbiotic algae, their importance of sustaining coral reefs, and the incredibly diverse ecosystems that we are destined to lose if we don't change how we feed our energy appetite. And we can't forget about the great discussion during the Q&A sessions. And of course, we're excited to hear what Dr. Carl Safina will have to say this evening about the fate of our ocean. And last night, some of us enjoyed the wonderful concert. It has been an awesome 2 days, and I hope that you've had as much fun as I did. I know that I'm tired, but I also know that I'm not alone. Putting on a conference of this magnitude is a community effort, from the electricians and plumbers and carpenters helping direct traffic to the students ushering and serving our food. Without everyone's help, this conference wouldn't be possible. At the same time, I need to mention a few groups in particular. The folks in dining service, the great food, of course, marketing and communication, who do all the work, media services, heroic productions, and of course, all of our speakers. And especially Julie and Joel. Thank you so much. At this time, I would like to introduce Dr. Joel Carlin, Associate Professor of Biology, to introduce our last speaker, Dr. Carl Safina. Thank you.
Thank you, Chuck. I would like to take a moment out of my time here to request that we all give a round of applause for all those persons that were mentioned and been working hard. So thank you. So, as we have heard from the amazing speakers over these past 2 days, the oceans are under threat. Temperature increase, pH change, microplastic, and a short-term utilitarian morality threaten the future of our ocean and of our species. The cause of this, in part, is certainly that we as individuals act as if the world is both inexhaustible and is there solely to serve us. Another cause, however, is rooted in choices made beyond the individual. In an ocean beyond national boundaries and beyond the public eye, each fisher faces the same economic choice. By choosing not to overfish, that company bears the entire cost of that choice to its employees and to its stockholders. However, by choosing to overfish on purpose, the company gains all of the profit from that action, while ecosystem damage is shared equally by all fishers everywhere, as well as we've learned over the past 2 days, all of marine life and the public at large. We all know what happens when every fisher, every corporation does this math equation. The world has seen fisheries stocks, in particular the great carnivores, but others as well, crash. And while species disappear at sea, the public receives inferior tasting products from lower and lower on the food chain, while underemployed fishing communities strain public services. The profits are taken by the few, and the costs are shared by the many. Few people are more familiar with this challenge to fisheries conservation than our next speaker, Dr. Carl Safina. Since earning his Ph.D. from Rutgers, he has served on the U.S. Fishery Management Councils and on scientific boards for the World Conservation Union and for the Smithsonian Institution. It was while participating in the conservation efforts for seabirds, tunas, billfishes, and sharks that Dr. Safina witnessed firsthand the enormous economic pressures that drive our greatest marine creatures towards extinction. With only the utilitarian moral ground, no single fisher, no single corporation can see the gain of a short-term reduction in fishing, and few governments are willing to set aside resources in the face of industry lobbying. But his efforts on behalf of marine conservation have not gone unnoticed. Carl Safina is a MacArthur Fellow, a Pew Fellow, and a Guggenheim Fellow. Audubon magazine has named him as one of the 100 notable conservationists of the 20th century. Currently, he hosts Saving the Ocean on PBS television, is founding president of the Blue Ocean Institute, and co-chairs the Center for Communicating Science at Stony Brook University. A model for science education, Dr. Safina has written over 200 scientific and popular articles, primarily on marine ecology and fisheries conservation. His first book, Song for the Blue Ocean, was awarded the Lannan Literary Award for Nonfiction and was on the top book lists of the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, and the Library Journal. And on a smaller but more personal note, his first book, this one, I'm sorry, I dropped this overboard more than once. Song for... People have thrown it over. Song for a Blue Ocean helped me decide to go back to school for a Ph.D. while I was still working as a marine biologist in the state of South Carolina, so that I could help train a new generation, even if they live in rural Minnesota, to study and respect the sea. Dr. Safina's latest book, The View from Lazy Point, A Natural Year in an Unnatural World, is a compelling, compassionate story of 4 seasons. The seasons are witnessed both around his Long Island home and in 4 corners of the globe. He has described penguins and parrotfish, salmon and sharks, each in their turn facing an ecological crisis. These crises are caused by those who, like the greedy child at Halloween, hoard candy no longer fit to eat. Tonight, I hope that you finish Nobel Conference 48 with the impression that perhaps, just perhaps, our global ocean is not a source for short-term profits. It is a home worth saving and worth sharing. And to this end, it is my pleasure and privilege to welcome Dr. Carl Safina.
Thank you very much, Joel, for that wonderful introduction. I certainly want to thank everybody who's been involved in this phenomenal conference. Just a really wonderful, wonderful array of fabulous speakers and great discussion. So what I want to do tonight is to talk a bit about this idea, a natural year in an unnatural world. I'm going to use my recent book, The View from Lazy Point, as the basis for my discussion with you tonight. Lazy Point is a real place. It's a real place at the east end of Long Island, and it's a place that I lived full-time for several years. But even though it is a real place, it is also sometimes an idea. What I want to talk about tonight are these questions. What is our relationship with the natural world? Why is it that way? What should it be? And does our relationship with the natural world matter in our relationships with one another? In addition to being around that place where I lived, I did what many of us do. I traveled, and the travels that I took went all the way from the high Arctic, across the tropics from the Caribbean to the West Pacific, down into the Antarctic. And if I'm going to ask you to spend a whole year with me and travel much of the world, I probably should tell you a little bit about who I am and who you're going to be taking this journey with tonight. Basically, I am a guy who likes to go fishing. That's basically who I am. And, all the rest is wardrobe. So, as you can see here, I did a lot of fishing starting from when I was a little kid. And I always like to show these pictures because this is my personal story. My past doesn't change. And when I got to be in my mid-teens, I was faced with what I come to call my first strategic challenge. And that is that I seemed to be growing up. At the time, I couldn't see any reason to grow up because I was having a very fine time around the coasts and the waters that had opened my heart as a young child, and I didn't want to see that end. And all of the adults that I knew went off to different kinds of jobs, most of which I didn't want to have anything to do with because they seemed exhausted at the end of the day, and they all complained that they were doing something that they wouldn't really do if they didn't have to make money. So that didn't seem like a good deal, and I had to figure out how to avoid growing up, which is kind of a tall order. If you look at the literature on how to avoid growing up, it's pretty thin. You have Peter Pan, not really the great role model. I didn't want to be Peter Pan. Then I discovered a remarkable social institution that is designed to prevent adulthood for the rest of your life. And listen carefully, it's called graduate school. So, I started to go to this thing called graduate school, and it allowed me to do all the things that I loved to do when I was a kid, except better and with a boat. So, what I did was I studied seabirds, I studied terns. I had loved terns since before going, because the terns led me to fish. This is what they do when they're really being what they are. They're seabirds, and I, believe it or not, I was one of the first people to study seabirds at sea, because most ornithologists come from the land side. I came from the fishing side, and most ornithologists studied seabirds where they laid eggs and raised their young, and it was kind of like just studying a person at home and in their bedroom and kitchen without knowing what they do when they go out in the world. So I wanted to see what they did out in the world, and I studied their relationship with the fish that they eat, how they find them, how the fish populations fluctuate. The big fish that drive the little fish to the surface both enable them to eat, but also compete with them. An odd kind of relationship, a sort of a constructive and destructive symbiosis. So terns gave me a lot. They gave me a lot of seafood. They gave me my Ph.D. While I was working on my Ph.D., I started to understand that the ocean was changing a lot and the fish populations were changing a lot. So the terns gave me my professional calling and really my whole career. And they also gave me the introduction, the prelude, as I call it, to this book that I'm going to be reading to you from tonight, The View from Lazy Point. So this is the very, very beginning of the book, and it takes off right from here with the terns. I slide a fishing rod into my kayak as birds begin gathering over our bay. They know what's coming, and so do I. On many summer afternoons, packs of surfacing bluefish chase up small fish, drawing excited flocks of diving terns. As it has been for millennia, so it is this very moment. I'm continually struck by how much beauty and vitality the world still holds. But beauty and vitality isn't the whole story either. In the panic among the fishes and in the frenzying terns, it's also evident that nature has neither sentiment nor mercy. What it does have is life, truth, and logic, and it strives for what it cannot have: an end to danger, an assurance of longevity, a moment's peace, and a comfortable death. It is like us all, because we are natural. What anyone needs to know about mercy, one can learn by watching nature and people struggling and realizing what a compassionate mind could add to that picture. So I'm also struck that we who've named ourselves wise humans, Homo sapiens, haven't quite realized that nature, civilization, peace, and human dignity are all facets of the same gemstone, and that abrasion of one tarnishes them all. The world still brims with the living. In the cycle of seasons and the waves of migrating fishes and birds that come and go along my home coast, I still find sanity and delight and the power and resilience of living things. But the wider lens of distant horizons reveals people and nature up against trends serious enough to rattle civilization in this century. The world still sings, yet we are risking much. We're borrowing heavily from people not yet born. Meanwhile, we run our lives in our world with institutions that cannot seem to detect the risks we're running. So, how to proceed? Well, I've come to see that the geometry of human progress is an expanding circle of compassion. And I believe that if the word sacred means anything at all, the world exists as the one truly sacred place. Now, when I'm home, I really enjoy watching all these things that come and go, all these migrations, so full of energy, and to realize that these creatures are doing what they have done for thousands of years. They're just trying to stay alive, and they're doing what it takes. We get visited not just by birds, but by all kinds of things: fish, sea turtles, whales, marine mammals, horseshoe crabs that come spawning in the spring on the full moons. That's a year at home, but in the course of this book, I also went to the poles and across the tropics to try to understand better what's going on and what it means for us and what it means for them. And I learned some things that I'm a little bit embarrassed to admit I didn't know, because I think I should have, especially as a marine ecologist. For instance, I always assumed that the reason there were lots of fish on coral reefs is that fish need the corals. What I learned was that the corals need the fish also, that if you catch too many of the fish that graze algae, like the parrotfish, if people catch too many of them, algae takes over the coral reef and the corals can't survive. I didn't know that. I think I probably should have, but it turns out that nobody knew that up until about 20 years ago. It's been happening for millions of years. People didn't realize. So I was learning things on these travels, and in between travels, I did what we do in between travels. I came home, and when I'm home, I like to start the day often by taking the dog for a walk on the beach. That's my dog. Her name is Kenzie. I have to say, she is no longer with us. She's a 50-pound black wolf, more or less, and then she goes loping along the shore, as is her custom, energetically invested in the obvious truth that all adventure lies at the tip of one's nose. And if you can detect that scent and follow it, it will take you far. And soon, as always, she's way ahead. Today, we woke to glass calm water. The sound is stretched taut to the far points of land. Out across the open water, the sea blends skyward with no horizon. On a morning this placid and beautiful, dying and going to heaven wouldn't be worth it. So a question arises: what should we do? That's an old question. Socrates asked it 2,300 years ago. Aristotle helped get the ball rolling on the answers 2,300 years ago. Here are some of the answers. He said, plants exist for the sake of animals, animals exist for the sake of man. It must be that nature has made all things specifically for the sake of man. St. Thomas Aquinas in the 1200s believed that only humans have an eternal soul, and that God gave all the animals to people for our use, and that people can kill or use animals however we desire, quote, without any injustice. "The world is made for man, not man for the world," boomed Francis Bacon around 1600. René Descartes in the 1600s believed animals lack consciousness and could be treated without concern for their well-being. He declared men lords and possessors of nature. Immanuel Kant in the 1700s believed that each moral being has the right at all times to be treated respectfully. The only catch was that only humans are moral beings. To Sigmund Freud, civilization's entire rationale is to defend us against nature. These thinkers drew a chalk circle around humanity and erected a firewall between us and the rest of creation. They may sound arrogant now, but their time was not our time. The world, so far as they knew it, didn't need our sympathy. That humans might ever acquire power enough to harm the world could scarcely have crossed their minds. Charles Darwin's great insight blasted a crater into the philosopher's firewall between humans and nature with his realization that all the world is kin. He wrote, "There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed by the Creator into a few forms or into one, and that whilst this planet has gone cycling on from so simple a beginning, endless forms most beautiful and most wonderful have been and are being evolved." Darwin's insight blurred borders, placing us on a continuum in an organic tree of life. Again, like Copernicus, like Galileo, here was a genius realizing we're not the center of the circle and pushing the borders outward. Aldo Leopold marked that wider perimeter with his softly stated revolution called the land ethic. And he wrote, "The land ethic simply enlarges the boundaries of the community to include soils, waters, plants, and animals. A land ethic changes the role of Homo sapiens from conqueror of the land community to plain member and citizen of it," unquote. In all the history of philosophy and ethical thinking, no one had ever quite come out and said, "We are part of the world." Imagine. In a universe devoid of life, any life at all would be immensely meaningful. And guess what? We are that meaning. And what we see, says the poet Mary Oliver, is the world that cannot cherish us, but which we can cherish. That sounds to me as though life itself is the great universal unrequited love of all time. Well, down along the shoreline, a red-winged blackbird calls, and then it listens, and then it calls again, because one note is not music. It's what lies between notes that makes the music, and what lies between them is their relationship. Relationships are the music life makes. Asking what is the meaning of life is the wrong question. It makes you look in the wrong places. The question is, where is the meaning in life? And the place to look is between. Now, as I was in graduate school and thinking and learning about the ocean and wondering why my fishing seemed to be getting worse every year, I started to look around to see what people were doing with the ocean, and I realized that we were doing things at a scale that I had not imagined previously. Now, in that photo on the lower right, that's 20 tons of a fish called orange roughy in that net. Anybody here remember seeing orange roughy on a restaurant menu? If you do, raise your hand high and just keep it there for a second. Now, of all of the people who remember seeing orange roughy on a restaurant menu, how many of you are under 30 years old? How many are under 30? 1, 2, 3. That's because we ate them all. These fish can live to be a century. They don't start breeding until they're 30 years old. Many of the students here will beat them at that. And there's nothing in the ocean that eats them 20 tons at a bite, and when we arrived in the deep places where they live, they had no way of withstanding us. Also, when we fish, we usually catch lots of stuff we're not actually fishing for. Based on the catch on this boat from South Carolina, can anybody guess what this captain is targeting, what he is trying to catch? Shrimp is the correct answer. And you can see that he's catching a lot of other stuff. If you look very closely, there is a shrimp there. Yay. Those guys on the deck take the shrimp and put them in the baskets, and then they take the brooms out and they sweep all of the other dead stuff overboard. That is shrimp fishing. In the tropics, people do things even more incomprehensible. They blow up the reefs that they rely on, and they cyanide the reefs to stun fish that they can reach in and grab. That's not a good strategy if you need to come back next week or you have children. That's what they do in many places. So over the course of my life, the ocean has had this big flip from a time when nothing in the ocean was considered overfished to the time now where 2/3 of what's there is considered overfished or crashed, which is severely overfished. And instead of over 80% of the fish in the world being considered underexploited, now really there is nothing anywhere that is considered underexploited. That's a big difference. Another way of looking at it is there were once many fish in the sea, and a lot of them were big. There are far fewer now, and a lot of them are small. And the seafloor, which was once a very complex place on the continental shelves, has been so flattened by dragging nets back and forth across it that it's much simpler than it used to be. That's what we see. What we don't see is that when we take all of that stuff, we take the next generation too. This is a fish called a spiny dogfish, a type of shark, actually giving birth in the net that has just killed her. These animals are pregnant for longer than any other animals known. They stay pregnant for 2 years, longer actually than elephants. So I thought this was a particularly poignant image to talk about the fact that what we do doesn't just affect us now across the world, it affects us in time as well, and it affects other people who are not here. When they get here, they look around, and what they see is what we've left them. It's not necessarily the way it's supposed to be, it's just what they've got. That's what we see. Like we showed up, and the most abundant animal in North America is the most abundant bird in North America is extinct, the passenger pigeons that lived here by the billions. We look around, there's no passenger pigeons. Okay, that's part of our world. Now, what will happen to all of these people, the hundreds of millions of people who rely on these reefs and these other places that are being diminished? You look at the ocean, you think it looks so big, how could we possibly affect it? But the interesting thing is we're so good at going and getting what we want that the declines in the ocean are well within the envelope of the declines on land, the forest and changes to grasslands, fresh water, all about the same. I don't entirely object to that, but I do object to using it up. Now, at one time, the only things that could spark mass extinctions or change the atmosphere on Earth were things like asteroid strikes and volcanoes. But humans are now truly a force of nature. We affect everything, including the options of people who are not yet born. People who cannot come to a hearing, they cannot write a letter to their congressional representative. They're not here, they can't talk about their interests, but we certainly affect those interests. We are borrowing from them, and we are dictating the terms of their loan to us. Why don't our institutions, and when I say our institutions, I mean the big things by which we run the world, our economic system, our religions, even Western philosophy, why don't these ways that we identify ourselves and ways that we value the world, Why don't they detect these curves that scientists make? Because those systems came online before anyone understood how the world works, and the problem is, it shows. We run the world with ideas that are hundreds or thousands of years old. Even capitalism, our economic system, was written down in the 1300s, and we still use the same method of accounting that was first described in the first book on economics, which says, among other things, that the main assets of banks are people's debts. And you see where that has gotten us in the last few years. Meanwhile, we just started learning how the world works right around, let's say, around 1800, when the first important astronomer, after 40 years of grinding better and better lenses that let him see farther and farther out in space, right around 1800 he said that deep space implies deep time. It was the first time anybody had any way of thinking about the fact that the world might be really old. Geologists really just started to invent their discipline in the early 1800s, and they showed that the way the world looks is not the way it always looked. That is the first time that ever occurred to anybody. The word scientist was coined after Charles Darwin was out on his voyage on the Beagle. The word dinosaur was coined in the 1840s. In the late 1850s, some odd-looking skulls from the Neander Valley were first suspected to maybe be a kind of people that don't exist anymore. Charles Darwin came out with his explanation for how life evolved only in 1859. We didn't think about ecology, the relationship among living things and the non-living environment, until the late 1800s and really the early 20th century. Any understanding of genetic inheritance from Gregor Mendel was actually buried for decades. Most of it was destroyed and was rediscovered only in the 20th century. The idea that little things you cannot see can make you sick, only in 1890. And the structure of life, DNA, only in the 1950s. That's a very, very recent resume for understanding how the world works. Just starting to understand how the world works. Now, by the middle of this century, supposedly we're going to add 2 more China's worth of people. That's possible, but it won't be pleasant, and if people will live the way they would like to live, with dignity and with stuff, it's not possible. It would require another 2 Earths. Yet, our economists, trained in the 1300s, tell us that everything is predicated on growth. Nothing is worth it unless it grows. Well, they don't seem to understand the difference between growth and development, growth and improvement. Growth is putting more material through the system. It's making it bigger. Growth isn't necessarily making it better. You can make a lot of things better without making them bigger. You can just improve how you do things. You can improve education, you can improve health, you can improve equity, you can improve justice. You can improve lots of things that really have to do with the quality of life without making it bigger. Economists don't seem to understand that. They also don't realize that the earth isn't growing. If we had fewer people and the same size economy, everybody would get more. So if the idea of growing is to give everybody more, but the planet cannot grow, do a little arithmetic on that. It's very, very simple. Now, I have had the unbelievable privilege in my life to spend a lot of the last couple of decades writing a series of books that get me around to some fantastic places with the best experts in the world. And they help me understand what they have recently learned about how the world works. I like hitchhiking with really big animals because I love animals, for one thing. And secondly, these animals that migrate across oceans feel everything that we're doing to change the world. So they are good traveling companions if you want to learn how the world is changing. Like these albatrosses, other great traveling companions. First of all, they're incredibly beautiful. Some species look to me like they were designed by some artist in the Art Deco era. Others are the biggest flying birds in the world in terms of wingspan. 11 feet tip to tip on this bird, the royal albatross. And they use those wings to travel hundreds of miles across the ocean to the little places, relatively little places, where the food is concentrated, across vast areas where the food is sparse. Guess who else does that? We do, of course. That's where our fishing boats are. They're all in the same place. The sea turtles, the bluefin tuna, the albatrosses, and the boats all go to the places in the ocean where the food is concentrated. Many of them get into trouble there. But it turns out that with albatrosses, this is looking out the back of a boat that is sending out a long line, which is a 25-mile fishing line with thousands of baited hooks. The albatrosses normally get right behind the boat. They try to get the bait off the hooks, and some of them get hooked. Now, if you're an albatross and you really need to live 50 years, and there are about 2 to 3 billion hooks set in the world every year, it's tricky to stay alive. But you notice the back of this boat, the birds are off in this semicircle around a big empty area. That's because, if you look closely, you'll see that there's a rope on each side of the boat there and some streamers. The birds don't like anything in the air where they're flying. Normally there is nothing in the air where they're flying except other birds. So they stay away from that. When a boat does this, their kill of albatrosses goes down 97% instantly. So, problem solved. When I was writing that book, people were wringing their hands. How can we ever solve this problem? Albatrosses are endangered. We're going to lose several species. Well, it was solved with 2 pieces of rope. Sea turtles drown in nets a lot. They drown in these nets that are dragged across the bottom. But it turns out that if you put something that looks like a barbecue grate in the net and cut a little flap, they can hit the grate and slide out the net. So, problem solved. But even though our major way of changing the ocean to date has been to take stuff out of it, that's not all we're doing. We're also putting a lot of things in, different kinds of things. Nutrients, which are really good for you unless you have too much. You know, food is good for you unless you have too much. Sugar is good for you. Too much sugar can give you diabetes and kill you. Nutrients. Most of the nutrients come from farms. In the United States, the Gulf of Mexico has a gigantic dead zone because of nutrients coming off of farms in the Midwest and coming down the Mississippi. There are toxic things we put in the water. There are hormones that we put in the water. So many people take birth control pills, it's actually affecting the sex ratios of everything from fish to certain kinds of mammals. And then there are other things that we put in things like flame retardants that mimic hormones and are affecting the gender identity of things as far away as polar bears. A few % of which now are born without a clear way of knowing whether they're males or females. What goes around comes around, but one problem with the current system is that what goes around tends to come around to other people who didn't cause the problem. These are basically called poor people. And these poor people happen to be American citizens. They live on the Arctic Circle in Alaska. They still eat a lot of things at the very top of the ocean food chain. So all of that stuff that we put in the air that comes down, or we put on the farms or the lawns that go in, all of that stuff gets concentrated in things like seals that they eat and whales that they eat. and it comes back and they become contaminated people. If we eat enough fish, we are contaminated people also, because it turns out that the coal we burn has mercury in it. We burn so much coal that we've put mercury in every fish on the whole planet. If you eat very high on the food chain, if you eat tuna and sharks and big stuff like that, and you eat enough of it, you'll wind up being unable to walk or talk, like somebody I actually know, who thought he was being very healthy by eating sushi for lunch and dinner every day of the week. He could afford it, and he loved the tuna. And he gave himself such a severe case of mercury poisoning that he's still recovering several years later. Now, you look at the world and you think, it's so big, the ocean is so vast, how could we ever affect the ocean? How could we ever affect the atmosphere? And it turns out that if you take all the water out of the ocean and you make it into one drop, that's it. That's that bubble. That's that drop. If you take all the air, you put the water back in the ocean, take all the air and blow one bubble, that's it right there. That's the whole ocean and the whole atmosphere. We look out, we think the ocean is so deep, the atmosphere is so vast, but the world is 8,000 miles in diameter, and the ocean's depth is an average only 2 miles. It's a tiny little bit. Basically, we live on a hard marble with not enough water to wet the whole surface, and a tiny little soap bubble of gas around it. That's our home. Now we have this other problem. We're affecting the heat balance of our home. We're changing the atmosphere quite significantly. Almost 40% more carbon dioxide in the air now than 200 years ago because of burning coal and oil, mainly. And the carbon dioxide is going up and up and up. It is also going up and down every year. I really like showing this graph because it shows how sensitive the measurements are and how honest they are. When it goes down, the graph shows it goes down. Does anybody know why it goes down every year? What happens in summer? Photosynthesis happens in summer. That's right. Most of the land is in the northern hemisphere. So in summer in the northern hemisphere, plants are growing. Plants take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. It shows on the graph. We tend to live in places where people look around, and up till recently, although I think this is changing, people say, the weather's not getting different. It's the same as it always was. But if you're in the Arctic, there are no skeptics in the Arctic. You can go with people and they can show you a place that not only where the glacier was another mile down the fjord in the last century, but also you can walk up the sides of that fjord to a bathtub ring where suddenly there are lots of Arctic flowers growing, and below that it's just gravel. 400 feet elevation up that fjord, it's gravel, and then suddenly Arctic flowers. Why is that? Because that glacier was 400 feet thicker in the early 1900s. And it shrunk so fast that those flowers and those little Arctic grasses and lichens have not been able to come down the slope yet. Things would be more obviously worse if the ocean wasn't doing us yet another favor by absorbing lots and lots of heat. As it absorbs heat in the polar regions, the ice melts. And this is a problem for things that live there that are adapted to ice. For instance, in the Antarctic, all of the vertebrates, the seabirds, the seals, the whales, they eat that little thing in the bottom right-hand corner called krill. And krill, when they are young, they graze algae off the bottom of sea ice. If the sea ice shrinks, let's say it shrinks 10%, that's 10% less food for the krill, and that means, to be totally simplistic, that means 10% less krill. Already, penguin populations are responding to that and moving around, and some of them are not surviving as well. If you go to the Arctic, we have this bear that lives far, far out in the ocean. If you look at the satellite tracks of tagged bears, they look like albatrosses. They're often hundreds of miles from shore. They live on the frozen ocean, and that's where they eat. That's where they get almost all their food, and they get it from basically one species, the ringed seal, which digs a hole to breathe. When the ice goes away, polar bears cannot hunt. You might think the ringed seals would be happy about that, but guess where ringed seals give birth? On the ice. It turns out that as doomed as polar bears will be, so are all these other animals that many of you probably have never even heard of. We're doing something to many, many creatures that we're not aware of, but they feel it. There are also ice-dependent Arctic vertebrates on two legs, like these people who are watching their island where they've lived for hundreds of years wash away because it used to be that in the fall the ocean froze and armored the sea and the land against the shrieking winds that would come in winter. Now the ocean doesn't freeze anymore, but the winds still come. So that's the mayor of the town standing in front of 16 houses that were just washed away, and they have to figure out where they're going to go, and they have a very good answer for where they would like to go. 5 miles across the bay is a gigantic territory that is their traditional hunting territory. No other humans live there. And everybody says, fine, go ahead. The only problem is they need about $150 million to move 600 people, rebuild their homes, rebuild the airstrip, rebuild the school, and the power plant, basically move their town. They have no idea where they're going to get $150 million. Imagine all the profits from all of the oil that comes out of Alaska. They have no idea where they're going to get that money. Now, if 600 Americans cannot move 5 miles to uncontested land, what is going to happen when, 5 million people or 20 million people in Southeast Asia, in a place like Bangladesh, where farms are being inundated by salt water and wells are being contaminated, when those people have to move 5 miles inland, right on top of other people who are barely making it as it is? And then what will we do here in the United States when they start fighting? Will we just sit it out like we seem to be able to not sit out other conflicts around the world? Or will their problems become our problems, finally? Here in the West Pacific, there are people on islands who, for the first time ever, just about 10 or 15 years ago, started to watch the tides come up into their backyards when the moon is full and the tides come up a little more, and when the moon is new and the tides come up a little more. They never saw water come up into their yards. I had dinner with that family with tropical fish swimming around my ankles. That's a new thing for them. That woman there is in her 80s. Her taro field, where she makes a living growing taro, is completely ruined. What is she going to do? We might think that this warming and these changes might at least be good for corals because corals seem to like it in warm water, but it turns out that if you warm their water just a little bit quickly, they start dying. It's not even good for them. And of course, a lot of the carbon dioxide that goes into the air also starts dissolving in the ocean, where it is changing the pH and robbing the carbonate from animals that make shells. In a laboratory, if you take the pH from the normal ocean pH, more or less at about 8.1, and move it down to about 7.7 or so, the larvae of urchins become deformed and die. Little tiny clams dissolve in about 3 days. Already on the West Coast, oysters, wild oysters, are not able to live anymore. What will that mean for all of those people? We have lots of choices. We can adjust, we can adapt. For many people, there are no choices. They're stuck where they are, and they have to take what comes their way, what we do to them or what we do for them. It's very hard to talk to American audiences where we do these things that create these situations and tell them about the pain and suffering of animals somewhere in another part of the world or people in some far-flung place, when our main personal problem, most of us, is that we eat too much. Now, this guy, Aldo Leopold, who I mentioned earlier, he wrote a fantastically important book called A Sand County Almanac. And I think that in a lot of ways he was the father of the environmental movement that was to follow. And then Rachel Carson really ignited it with her concern about toxic chemicals. His concern was more about how we use the land. And he has here a scientific statement. Land is a community. That's a basic concept of biology. That's just a fact. It's a fact no one ever knew before, not before the 20th century. It was new when he wrote that down. And that fact had implications. Here's something that is, and that means here's something we should do. The fact had implications for what we should do. Yet, scientists are trained never tell people what to do. Just put the facts out on the table and then walk away and let the policymakers decide what to do. And I agree, in a perfect world that would be great, because scientists should do science and policymakers should take facts and make policies that make sense based on those facts. But that is, of course, not at all how it works. How it works is that people jam the signal. They say, oh, the science is wrong. They say the science is just another opinion. They say it's going to cost too much to change things. They don't just say, here are the facts. Now, what do these facts mean? And so scientists who just walk away from the facts forfeit their moral and intellectual power. Other than the climate change issue, science has really chosen irrelevance for itself in our society. Very few people know a scientist. Very few people can name a scientist. That's a problem, because science tells us what's really going on, and it's the only thing that's really designed to tell us what's really going on. If you do your science well, it doesn't matter if you are male or female, or Christian or Muslim, or white or black, you'll get the same answer if you do it right. There's nothing else in the world like that. It's very important. Science is very, very important. Imagine if a medical doctor found some cure to something and didn't think it was important enough to really tell people that he could cure this problem. Or imagine an engineer realizes that the calculations for a bridge were wrong, and that at that age that bridge is, it's likely to collapse, and he just didn't tell anybody. Would he be called more professional? And yet with ecologists, that's exactly the way it is. If you know there's an enormous problem and you know what to do about it, the professional thing to do, they're told, is don't talk about it very much. Why is that so messed up? Who gave us that idea? Do scientists have a moral obligation? That's a question. I believe they do. Now, for most people, science provides information, but they don't look to science for moral answers. Most people look to religion for moral answers. Imagine if the power of science could be linked to the moral authority of religion. But the problem is many religions have decided that the way the environment is, the way nature is not a religious matter. That religion is about the spiritual realm, not the profane realm on the surface of the planet. That's unfortunate. I've been involved in a couple of efforts to bridge this gap. One was to bring some leading evangelicals, including the head of the American Association of Evangelicals and his vice president, up to the Arctic with the head of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and a couple of other key people, to show how the climate is changing, that this is not fooling around. It's not something for the future. It's It's happening now, and it affects people. It was a very, very good trip, and very interesting, I think, on both sides. This is not the sole province of Christianity. These people on an island off of Tanzania have decided that the Quran tells them that the role of human beings on earth is to be the stewards of God's creation. And inspired by that, they are replanting forests that they cut down. They're protecting coral reefs. They say, if you cut a tree, you must plant a tree. That makes sense. I don't think we need to wait for all the science on trees to come in before that makes sense. I want to get back to my friends the albatrosses for a few minutes here and tell you what I've learned from them. I've learned from albatrosses that we are not the only creatures in the world who care for each other. These birds mate and stay paired for decades, and they show a very obvious attachment and affection to each other. And it makes sense because what they have to do to raise their children is very complicated and very difficult. We're not the only creatures on this planet who care for our children. This is the actual track, the dark line is the actual track of a satellite-tagged albatross. That whole picture is the whole North Pacific Ocean. You see the Bering Sea, the Gulf of Alaska. On the upper left is the Kamchatka Peninsula of Russia. On the right is the west coast of the US and Canada. She has a chick in a nest on a little island northwest of Hawaii called French Frigate Shoals. And you can see there that she goes on a trip to get one meal for her chick. She goes on a 9,000-mile trip where she starts out by going straight up more than 1,000 miles to where the cold Arctic water meets the warmer Central Pacific water. And at that point of friction, there's more food. So that's where she goes first and starts hunting. She goes west, and every time you see her track loop around, it means she's found a patch of food, and she's trying to fill up. Then she comes back right along that line, and she just suddenly makes a right turn, and over the whole trackless ocean, she goes more than 1,000 miles straight to her nest on an island half a mile wide. People can't do that. You try doing that with MapQuest, you will get lost. Why don't we honor the abilities of creatures whose abilities are beyond us? She comes and she feeds the chick. She spends about 15 minutes feeding the chick, and then she takes off. She doesn't hang around for a few days. She doesn't get her toenails done. She doesn't rest. She just leaves again. This is what her island looks like in the middle of the world's biggest ocean, farther from any continent than any other group of islands in the world. We might not be thinking about them, but we are there. And when they feed that chick, that is literally passing life from one generation to the next. It is the continuity of life. It is the chain of being. If anything, I think, is sacred, then certainly continuing life is a sacred thing. And here this albatross, after a 9,000-mile, one-month trip to give one meal to its chick, is feeding it a screw top from a plastic jar that she swallowed somewhere out in the ocean because there's so much floating plastic. All of the albatrosses have plastic in them. It doesn't always kill them. It's certainly never good for them, though. And it does sometimes kill them. This is a chick cared for 6 months, almost ready to fly. It died, and it was packed with red cigarette lighters. Now, this is not the relationship with the world that we are supposed to have. It's not the relationship with the world that we would choose if we were thinking about it. But it is the one that we have chosen by not thinking about it. And this is not an idea to these birds. This is pain. It's death. It's very real. Are we stuck with these problems? Must we ride these problems to the bitter end? We had an oil industry once. They almost ran out of their oil. The first oil wells were called whales. First drills were called harpoons. They weren't thinking of us. Now we have a different oil industry. It's also not thinking about us, and it's certainly not thinking about the next generation. But we're told, well, but we can't do anything because it's so cheap. Coal is cheap. Oil is cheap. Why is it cheap? It's cheap because we don't pay the costs in the price of the oil and the coal. It's cheap because all of the costs and all the risks are spread to everybody. The price does not involve the cost. The cost of coal involve blowing mountains apart, acidifying streams, burying a few miners now and then, creating thousands of cases of asthma, putting mercury in every plate of seafood, changing the heat balance of the entire world, acidifying the oceans, and dissolving the coral reefs of the world. That's the cost of coal. It's not in the price, but it will be paid. We had another kind of energy once where people fought over the fact that it was cheap. The cheapest energy is slaves. Slaves are still cheap. But we understand now with hindsight that slavery is just morally unacceptable. Maybe 100 years from now, people will look back and say, how could those people have been confused over whether what they were doing to the world was right or wrong? How could they have argued over that? How could they have fought over that? It's so clear that it's so wrong. Maybe that's what they'll say. Now, Charles Darwin, who was always insightful about everything, also was a staunch abolitionist. He and his family hated slavery. And he said, the simplest reason would teach each individual that he ought to extend his social instincts and sympathies to the men of all nations and races. Our sympathies becoming more tender and more widely diffused until they're extended to all sentient beings. You can see the origins of human traits in the behavior of other animals, in their drive to survive, in their passion to reproduce, in their curiosity, and even in glimmers of true caring. My neighbor, J.P. at Lazy Point, had been hand-feeding a gull that landed on his roof each morning, and one day last summer it arrived with a bill full of fine grass and other nesting material and delivered it into his hand. But uniquely among animals, our minds are gifted with a capacity for extension, reflection, and far-ranging compassion. Compassion doesn't simply mean caring for poor people or putting Band-Aids on need. It seeks to remedy the sources of suffering. It means we require a clear, peaceful way of providing what the world can bear and understanding when enough is too much. In part, it means realizing that far fewer people would mean far less suffering. And the easiest route to fewer people is teaching girls to read and to write. I used to think conservation was about saving sea turtles and tuna and falcons and forests. I thought educating girls was a different cause. But the thing is, people matter to nature, and nature, it turns out, matters to people. Because educating girls simultaneously breaks poverty and reduces family size, it matters to people and nature. It is conservation and compassion combined. But reducing poverty and child mortality, controlling disease, and ensuring education, quote, cannot be achieved, according to the United Nations, as long as most ecosystem services are being degraded. In other words, we can't heal the world without healing humanity, and we can't heal humanity without healing the natural world. Now, to advance compassion and yet survive in this world of appetites is a challenge. Where any weakness is crushed or exploited, empathy must be load-bearing. Yet, compassion may be the lightest, strongest concept yet devised because, century upon century, it wages a widening peace. Compassion asks not what is good for me, but what is good. Not what is right for me, but what is right. Not how much can we take, but how much ought we leave, and how much might we give? Not what is practical, but what is moral. Very few things, each of them simple, are needed. We shouldn't hate people for the group they were born into or because we hold conflicting beliefs about things that cannot be seen or measured. We cannot take infinitely more from or add infinitely more people to a finite planet, and we cannot run civilization on energy that diminishes the world while we're living in a world endowed and run and powered by self-renewing energy. If we can get those simple things under control, I think we could be okay. But simple doesn't mean easy. And yet, more than ever in history, we can now understand what is needed. A person can seek ways, whether big or small, to heal the world, and the moral must guide the technical. But whose morals? Well, it turns out we have the benefit of some hard work by other people. Love your enemies, said Jesus. We've been formed into nations, the Quran says, that we may know each other. Our responsibility to heal the world is central to Judaism. Compassion is what brings Jews, Christians, and Muslims to what they call God, and what the Buddha says will bring you to nirvana. Confucius propounded the Golden Rule 5 centuries before Christ did. The ability to feel along with another is the minimum standard of religiosity, because in compassion, says the former nun and author Karen Armstrong, we dethrone ourselves from the center of the world. That's religion, but in science, it's much the same. Remember, we've got Copernicus's astoundingly counterintuitive deduction that the sun and the universe do not revolve around us, Darwin's perception of the totality of our relatedness, and Aldo Leopold's insight that our true community is the community of life and all that supports it. That, to me, is spirituality and one's soul. Not some disembodied eternal wishfulness, but a way of being that most days I can try to work on. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that although I'm a secular person and a scientist, I believe that our relationship with the world must be mainly religious. But I don't mean theological. I mean religious in the sense of being reverent, revolutionary, spiritual, and inspired. Reverent because the world is unique and thus holy. Revolutionary in making a break with the drift and downdraft of maladaptive modes of thought. Spiritual in seeking attainment of a higher realm of human being. Inspired in the aspiration to connect crucial truths with wider communities. Religion in precisely this way, connection with a sense of purpose. We are self-assembled stardust aware of the universe and the future. Energy that had been headed across the eternal infinite vacuum of space is at this moment running the thought machine that is you. We're one knot in a great web of being, building out of the vast past and, with luck, continuing billions of years into the future, until the sun dies and our local light goes out. The most appropriate response to the mystery of being alive is to realize with awe and with love the ferocious miracle of it, and to act accordingly. The worst thing anyone should be able to say about their life is also the best thing anybody can say. I tried my best. Now, after all of this travel and this year of thinking and writing, I realized something that I think I should have known at the beginning, but I didn't really realize it in words until the very end, and that is that at this stage in history, nature and human dignity require one another. Where people have had their dignity robbed, where they live under the oppression of terrible governments, they don't have the luxury of taking care of nature. Where people have destroyed the nature around them, think of Haiti, for example, they cannot get back on their feet. Human dignity and nature require one another. You can't have either without both. Now, I think hope is crucial. But I don't mean wishfulness. When I say hope, I mean the ability to see how things could be better. For all of these problems we are talking about, we can see how they could be better. That gives me great hope. And hope powers all work. Hope inspires. And when I say inspires, I mean inspiration is the urge to act. We need hope, and we need to be inspired. Well, that's the view from Lazy Point, and I'm sticking to it for now. You can see us in the usual places. I have a show coming out this fall on PBS, and you can see this on the web anytime. As those shows go out, you can watch them. So I hope to leave you hopeful and inspired, and I want to thank you all very, very much for inviting me to this phenomenally great conference with these wonderful, wonderful people we've had. All of this good thoughtfulness, this deep thinking, and this deep feeling. So thank you very, very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
You ready to take some questions? Yeah. Dr. Safina has agreed to take a couple questions, and I think we have time for one or two.
Well, I mean, as far as what I have to say, you can find my stuff on the web, my talks and things like that. You can, I have a website, obviously. I have these books which all of this stuff is in. So these are my vehicles, and they're accessible. But I think as far as spreading the message, this is an educational institution. We live in a place where we can speak. All politics is local, they say. There are lots of things that we can do to talk about and begin to act on any of these things. I mean, people push their communities in different ways. It's often messy. It takes effort, but you choose the part of it that you want. So some people are teachers, some people are political activists, some people are donors to causes. Some people are lawyers. It depends on what you can bring. And as I often say, and as I said this afternoon, nobody can do everything, but everybody can do something. Yes.
So how do you break the cycle? If moral dignity, if a lack of moral dignity means you can't take care of the nature, and without nature you vicious cycle. That how do you get out of that once you get in it? And so much of the world is impoverished right now and doesn't have the resources to take care of nature, and therefore nature won't have the resources to take care of us. How do you break that cycle?
Right, but those extremes are a minority of the world, I think. And we live in a big, very influential country. We do lots of things that affect the rest of the world, and what we do is, in theory, up to people and how they vote here and what kinds of things they demand here. There are ways of going out in the world and helping other people. There's a huge middle ground between the starkness of total poverty and the great benefits and luxuries that we have. But we're blowing it. We are diminishing instead of caring for the world around us. And people need to straighten out this declining line and understand that you cannot abuse it, you cannot push these problems onto other people in the future, that these things hurt us. These things hurt us. And it goes not, it's not just nature. The thinking that goes into the problems that we have with nature is the same thinking that goes into corporate governance and banking and politics. The decline of the ocean and the decline of fish populations and the decline of tropical forests and wildlife is part of the same thinking that got us the destruction of all of a century's worth of legislation to protect the public from banks running amok, so they ran amok, and they basically ruined the world economy. It's the same. So the Rust Belt is a result of us failing to demand that we don't send our jobs to another place just because they can do it cheaper while not caring at all for their laborers, paying them dirt, and poisoning them. That should have been, it's unacceptable to us in this country. Why did we allow people to do it somewhere else with our whole manufacturing economy? These things they're unacceptable. They're unacceptable. And many of us can remember a time when people were more spirited about their refusals. People now are pretty complacent, unfortunately. And I think that we've blown a very, very good time. As Sylvia Earle says, we lived in the sweet spot. We should have kept it there. But our complacency in allowing all of this erosion is creating problems. And it's creating problems mainly for the people who didn't cause the problems. It is a matter of taking care of what you have before you don't have it at all anymore. That's my answer to that. So thank you very, very much. I really appreciate it.
What a great conference. Carl, I must say in your very last comments that the one place that is not complacent is an academic institution. An academic institution is chartered to be a place of inquiry, a place to go deep, a place to ask the difficult questions. That's what things like the Nobel Conference do for us. That's what Lars Heikensten was saying to us from Sweden. That's what you all have said to us. Our students are asking those questions. They bring life into the discussion. So thank you for being part of that. Gustavus is committed to giving our students the best education possible and to address the important questions we face in society today and in the future. We are helping people find their own voice on these important topics and giving them an opportunity to explore in depth the significant research that is being done to enlighten all of us. First, I want to thank Chuck and Julie and Dr. Carlin. Thank you so much for all that you have done for this institution by putting on this great conference this week. I want to thank Dr. Gallo for starting everything in Minneapolis for the first preview lecture. I want to thank Maya and Barbara and Bill and Chris. I want to thank Kathleen, balance Kathleen, perspective, imagination, laughter, courage, think big. Remember, we talked about realizing that nobody can do everything, but everyone can do something. That's what happens on a college campus. Ove, thank you so much. Carl, Chris, you will always be now Augusti. These have been great days as a college of the church, rooted in that tradition. Understanding the importance of theological and philosophical questions, and understanding the differences of what that means as we look at these questions surrounding the issues that we discussed these last 2 days. I think we are better people after the last 2 days and have a better understanding of our global oceans. Good night. Have a great, safe trip home.
Just a quick announcement that Dr. Safina's books are available for sale, and he will be signing books just outside the door, outside the cafeteria.